time to have a look at how to write your own stories. Let's make a one-shot. Welcome to the Attic Dungeon. My name is Sam, and whether you like it or not, I'm here to help you with everything. So today we'll be having a look at what you need to keep in mind when creating a one-shot. What is a one-shot? Usually it is an adventure that can be played in a single session of, in our case, Dungeons & Dragons 5e. So it's a mini adventure that is usually not part of a larger story. One-shots can be great to introduce new people to the game or the genre in general. And to be honest, you can also use them to run short campaigns. Not that long ago, I ran a mini campaign that was basically comprised of 6 one-shots. There was a little bit of an overarching storyline in there, but nothing too big. I just wanted to get a group of people together for a while, play some games, have some fun, and then move on to our other games again. So one-shots, I love them, and they're also a really good place to start writing for Dungeons & Dragons. If you want to create your own content, your own stories, one-shots are a lot less complicated than trying to write an entire 20-level campaign first, which was what I tried to do initially, and I was like, this is hard, and it's hard to make everything work as I want it. Let's do one-shots first, and that's my advice to you as well. Start with one-shots. Now, for a one-shot, the first thing that you have to realize, I've said it already, we're looking at 3, maybe 4 hours of playtime, so that is very concise. You don't have time to branch out into your homebrew world up for times and hours and hours and hours. No, you have to limit to the theme that you want to present to your players, and that is your first question. What do you want to play? Then what do you want your players to encounter? Do you want some search and rescue, which is going to be combat heavy? Do you want an intrigue heavy, politicky one shot? Maybe you want a murder mystery, or as I like to call them, a contained sandbox. You can't go full sandbox in a one shot because, as I said, time constraints. Your players can't say, okay, we're in this town because we need to do this, but first we want to go all the way over there and go and kill some orcs. That's not really an option in a one-shot, and usually players are aware of this, that there is going to be some railroading involved to make sure that the adventure is completed in the single session. That doesn't mean that the adventure can't be a bit sandboxy. You can drop them somewhere where they have to fulfill a few tasks in a non-specific order, for example. So your theme, that is the first thing you need to think of, because it's going to be everything. It is going to be the foundation of your one-shot. It is the one thing that you have to keep in mind. Now, where do you get inspiration? You can get it anywhere. Maybe you want to do something based on a book you read, a movie, something cool you read somewhere. Personally, my series of one-shot shots were all based on songs. So basically, I took 6 songs, converted them into one-shots, and ran those for my players. Every one-shot had a very different theme. There was some interplanar mystery. There was a simple search and rescue. There was a city being besieged. There's a lot of different things that allow your players to come into situations that normally don't happen that naturally in a campaign. Still, pick a theme and stick to it. It is going to decide a lot, including how you build your encounters. We'll get back to that on a moment. And again, don't get sidetracked. Now, as I said, it is always going to be fairly railroady because it's a one-shot, but don't take away player agency. If you have this big bad monster that you really want to use in a fight, but your players are approaching it in a non-violent way and are actually doing a really good job at doing so, don't force them to fight. It's the same as in any other campaign. It's still the players who have a lot of agency. Of course, if the monster is a mindless beast that cannot be conversed with and the party has no way of doing so, go ahead, maul them. But for example, the last one-shot that I ran in the 6-shot series was a level 15 one-shot. It took place more in celestial realms already, let's say. And I had this big guy, angel thingy, that I was able to attack 7 times in a row. It's like, yeah, that's going to be fun for a few rounds of combat and then we're done, perfect. Instead, our Bard rolled a 34, I think, on intimidation. And I was like, okay, now I have to give him the option of entering a conversation and doing stuff. And it went completely different direction than I had originally planned, but that's wonderful. Now, when we get to combat, actually. Don't be afraid to adjust things to fit within your team. That's to say, you might see a monster that has really cool abilities, but it absolutely doesn't fit your theme. Reskin the monster. Nice example, my players were stuck in a Fey pocket dimension. So everything is Fey around them, blah blah blah, but some of the monsters that I were actually using weren't Fey at all. Why do you want to do this? Because maybe some of the abilities really fit in with what you're trying to create, the atmosphere you're trying to create, and it also kind of avoids metagaming if that would be an issue in your group, because the party might think they're fighting some medium level Fey, but they're actually fighting a hag on paper, or maybe an ogre for all I care. It just looks like a Fey, and it keeps your players kind of guessing about what they're fighting, which is fun to do with an experienced group of people, because they might know a lot of the monsters, and this way you can keep stuff fresh for them. Combat can also be a little bit rougher than you would usually think. It's a one-shot. That means that your players are going to start with their full amount of resources at the start of the one-shot. And except if you're playing at like level 1 or level 2, this gives them a lot of options. Once you reached 7, 8 level, your players have a decent amount of spell slots, class abilities, maybe even some magic items you've allowed them to pick, whatever. There's a lot of stuff they can do, and if you just make encounters that are on the normal challenge rating level, as we'll call it, they're probably going to waltz right through them. So don't be afraid to create deadly encounters for the one-shot. Never be afraid to create deadly encounters, but actually for one-shots, if your players have their full resources at their disposal for the length of the one-shot, really amp up the combat, give them a challenge if you're dealing with experienced players. If you're dealing with new players, keep it calm. Don't go for the TPK right from the get-go. Speaking of resources, actually, one way to solve this is by not giving your players all of their resources. I've done one of the one-shots that I ran was a city under siege. The party was involved in the siege, and they had already gone through some fighting before the one-shot began. They didn't know this. I mean, I just said, okay, prepare your characters, it's level 7, this, that, and then a few hours before the one-shot, I went into their character sheets. I had access to the sheets. It was D&D Beyond. And I just indicated some stuff that they had already used. And then I started my story and explained, look, you were involved in multiple combats already. These resources have been used. Now, go. And this immediately creates more of a campaign-y feel where you're trying to create the dragged out feeling of a party that has to actually manage their resources, but you're still playing a one-shot. So that is actually a really good way, I found personally, to simulate resource starvation even within a one-shot. Don't do it all the time. Give them those one-shots where they can go full out with the fireworks, use all the fancy spells that you have given them access to. But if you're playing multiple one-shots with a group of people, like I did, resource starving them before the one-shot begins is actually really nice. Other ways of pumping up the difficulty level is adjusting a few rules. In another one-shot, again, this is more for a series of one-shot, I suppose, this specific one. But I removed death saving throws because they were in hell. They were fighting devils and demons on their home turf. So if you KO'd there, the devil would just take your soul. End of story. Since they were characters that were being used 6 times, the player just had some attachment to them. So yes, the risk of death could be good. It can also completely transform their playstyle, because if somebody dies halfway through the adventure, they have to complete the adventure with a fewer people. So that's also a challenge. So stuff like that, resource starvation, taking away death saves, can actually really up the difficulty level or create a more tense atmosphere for the players. Instead of knowing, oh, we're level 9, it's a one-shot, we got level 5 spell slots, we don't really care, we'll just blow stuff up. Also, don't be afraid to give some of your like boss type monsters legendary resistance, because as you might know, if you have one large monster versus a group of players, usually the group of players has the advantage. They have 4 turns in which they can attempt to immobilize the boss monster, and your boss only has 1 turn. So to avoid them being charmed, hold monster, hold person, polymorphed like this in turn 1, give them like two buttons of legendary resistance to keep your boss in the fight, because it is a one-shot. You want some spectacular event to happen, and you want to be sure that some of these happen. Now, if you are going for that 3-hour one-shot, let me give you some handy pointers to help you to try and contain your story within those 3 hours. If you are going to play a combat-heavy one-shot, the absolute maximum of combat encounters will be 3 probably. Any more and you will probably fail to keep it contained within 3 hours. Kind of depends on what type of combat, but the moment you have combat with a larger amount of creatures on the board, the pace slows down, so that takes longer, etc, etc. So 3 is really the absolute maximum of amount of combat encounters rather for 2 to 3 hours of one shot. If you want your players to have the opportunity to do some other things as well than actually fight, either prepare for a longer one shot or keep it to 2, maybe even just 1 combat encounter. I've had one of the one shots that I ran had the possibility of going through the entire adventure without combat. If the players do this and that happens, etc, etc. It was completely possible to finish the story without fighting. Obviously that did not happen. They had 2 fights, I think. One was kind of planned, the other one just kind of happened. Oh well. That's what happens there. So 2 fights if you want to do other stuff apart from fighting as well. 3 if you just really want a combat heavy encounter. Also take player agency into your time calculation. You could easily underestimate how long players can take to play through what you might think is a 5-minute introduction to the adventure. The moment the players get the opportunity to ask questions or there is some hint of mystery involved, they might strike out and try to investigate things already before the adventure has really started, and things that you might not have thought to be relevant suddenly become relevant and have to be involved in the story. So do be prepared to improvise a bit. I advise against writing everything word by word on a sheet. I think for most of my one-shots, my preparation is like 1 page of text, and that has the encounter, the general idea of the story, and maybe a few specific replies that some of my characters need, but that is the general build. 1 page for 3 hours of play is more than enough. So limit your combat encounters if you want to do other things. Take into account that players can take a really long time to do simple tasks. I've had players who just had to weasel themselves into the backstage of a performance. They could have just convinced a few bodyguards, what have you, and gotten in. Instead, they sold themselves as the opening act of said show, and suddenly I had to spend 40 minutes on DMing a mime performance organized by my party. Instead of just really running in, having a conversation with the interested party for, let's say, 15 minutes, and then get out and do the quest that they were supposed to do. So just that's why keep your preparations pretty bare bones to allow your players to really get involved in the story. And that's it already. Yes, it's another short one this week. I'm kind of enjoying my Easter break for now, so I'm keeping it short. Don't worry, the Attic Dungeon will return with character guides that are way too long in a few weeks. Until that time, stay safe, and I'll see you again in 2 weeks in the Attic Dungeon.